So the conversation is, what if vulnerability was more courageous than bravery? And these are all very interesting words to me. I'm kind of a word nerd. I like to jump in and take them apart and then use words in a different way than they were originally intended for. For example, the name of my company is Ruin Your Life. So it's kind of, how can we take this and flip it on its head and then have a different conversation about it? So that's kind of the goal today with vulnerability, courage, and bravery. How can we take that conversation, flip it on its head a bit, and see how we can switch that around. So before we get started, Brian talked on this as well, is how are we going to set up the space? So when we're having these types of conversations, hopefully we're able to dig in some deeper pieces, but we want to make sure when we do that we're creating psychological safety. And so this is kind of my framework for creating a psychologically safe space in these types of conversations. And I call it a safe square space. So there's 4 corners in this space. So corner 1 would be the space itself. So we want to be able to make space for each other and then take space for ourselves. We want to be able to challenge ideas and practices, not the person. So if I believe that vulnerability is a positive part of interaction and does not make us look weak, and Brian says, I think vulnerability makes us look weak, then I challenge the idea and the concept. I don't attack Brian as a person. So that's the difference there. Everyone has equal worth and all perspectives are valid. So just because I'm here as the host in this meeting does not make my perspective or my opinion more valid than yours. Corner 2 would be the assumptions. So we want to lose self-judgments and judgments. So a self-judgment would be a disclaimer. So if you're starting to make a statement and you're like, I know this is a stupid statement, but, so that's a disclaimer. We don't need those in safe space. So all of those can just drop away. And then owning your perspective with I statements instead of projecting. So if you feel a way, you can say things. It's a safe space to say, I don't feel like vulnerability makes you feel weak, instead of having to say, I heard that other people feel that vulnerability doesn't make you feel. So this is a safe space to be able to really own those statements and those feelings. And then assuming common best intentions for the people around us. I don't really know y'all. I use words like y'all. I don't know if y'all use y'all, but I don't know y'all. But I assume that common best intentions are kind of throughout the room here. So if something comes across to me and I hear it kind of like, I'm going to assume best intention and move on and ask clarifying questions if I need to. So then corner 3 would be the human. So we respect everyone's right to be grumpy, to be triggered, or to fail. We are talking about some bigger concepts here, like vulnerability. So I respect your right to feel a little grumpy about some of the things that I may say or other people might say, or be triggered by those things, or to make a statement that is a quote unquote failure, but you should know that I love failure. So I don't know why that's on the bad list. And then honor differences always, make them central when appropriate. So that would come into things like if we're talking about race or sexual differences or those types of things. Those are great things, but they don't always have to be central. But we honor those differences. If they need to come into the conversation, we bring them in, but they don't have to remain the highlight of everything. You are a human with or without all of those labels. And then to acknowledge emotions, we are going to feel things in conversations, and that's valid and appropriate, and we can stop for a second and feel those things. And then lastly, corner 4 would be consent. So we listen with attention, eye contact, body language, preferred pronouns if they're different than what we assume. Please share those with us so that we use the correct pronouns in conversation. Be risky and speak up. This is my huge one here, but maintain others' rights to pass. So I love when you speak up. I want to hear you more than me. Hopefully this is the longest that I talk, this whole darn thing. But then I respect your right to pass as well. So please jump in if you want to join the conversation, but not everybody is required to jump in. And then lastly, silence is not bad. We allow that space. So sometimes that awkward silence allows for that space for thoughts to come and for us to get to kind of that next point. If you ever heard the statement that boredom spurs creativity, this is kind of that piece. So awkward silence brings the next part of the conversation that we want to get to. So those are kind of the 4 corners to remember as we're diving into the conversation, that we want to maintain the safe square space. And with the space, the assumptions, the human, and the consent. Cool. Any thoughts on a safe space? I'm just going to keep going. And then if you have them, throw them in there. Brian's in charge of that. I can't see the chat at the same time, so I just work here.
It's all right, good.
So okay. So first, like I said, we want to have a common understanding for the words that we're using. I work a lot in trauma-informed spaces. And one big thing when hosting or when working in trauma-informed space is that we want to use what's called a common language. So when I use a word, the way that I understand and use that word is the same as the way that you understand and use that word. So that's the foundation that we're going to set here, is so that we have a, quote unquote, common language for these words. And I don't know the Y on vulnerability just jumped over there, but it's going to be vulnerability is the word apparently. So bravery, courage, and vulnerability are the three words that we're going to create a common understanding for. So first, I want to jump in and have some feedback from you guys on what do those words look like and sound like to you first off. So first, we're going to do bravery. And I want you to think about two things as you're answering. Hopefully there'll be two sides to the answer. What does bravery mean to you? So that would be, how would you describe it? If it was in a dictionary or Urban Dictionary or your own dictionary, what would that word, what's the definition or the description of the word? And then the other side of that is, what feelings does that word spark in you? For example, if I say I have a puppy named Charlie, and so if someone says Charlie, I'm like, ooh, it's squishy and fuzzy, and I want to hug it, and I love it so much, and it gives me these feelings of joy and squishy. So think of those feelings too when you hear those words as well. So first, what does bravery mean to you, and what feelings does it spark in you as a word? Ready, set, go.
If anybody wants to put anything in the chat, please do so now. We can sort of reflect on anybody's answers, or if you want to speak, please feel free to do so. If you want to ping I in the chat, and Yasin, learners, if any learner wants to speak, let us know. It's all good.
Maybe I can jump in and say, when I think of the word bravery, I think of the image of stepping up or stepping into or stepping forward for something, and kind of putting yourself in the space where there's a possibility that you might be vulnerable.
Yeah, very much stepping up. I think that's a good one. Someone put in the chat, facing your fears. I think that's a good one.
There's Celia as well. Do you want to read them out, Chelsea?
Yeah, stepping out of your comfort zone, being able to do the things you want to. That's an interesting one. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, being able to do the things that you want to do. But what about feelings? Does anybody have, what feelings kind of pop up with that? Confidence. Competency, yeah.
Feeling empowered.
Empowered, yeah, that's a good one. Are these like current feelings? So when you think of times that you've been brave before, are you thinking, ooh, I was empowered, I was confident, I had competency? Or are these projection feelings? Like, I hope that next time I feel empowered, confident, or competent.
Yeah, funnily, whenever I thought, the first thing I thought of when I thought of being brave is I thought anxiety.
Yeah.
A little bit, like that sense of anticipation. Yeah.
Yes. I would say for me, that's more of my right now feeling with bravery, right? And someone put change makers, scared. So if I were looking at my right now feeling of bravery, initially when that word pops up, it is more of that, like, I'm going to do this, but I'm feeling a little, I have some anticipatory anxiety about that. It is able to attempt to make what is impossible in my mind possible. I like that. Oh, change makers is the learning program. Well, it works for bravery too. I mean, all of that goes together. Nervous yet excited. Yeah. So I think there's two different kinds of emotions for bravery. There's the right now emotions and the projection emotions, and both are valuable, right? So what is the right now emotion? I know that I'm feeling nervous, I'm feeling anxious, I'm excited, all those types of things. And interestingly enough, anxiety and excitement are the exact same firing neurons in your brain. So those two things are the exact same thing. So if you just switch out that word the next time you're feeling anxious for excited, your brain is doing the exact same thing, and you're kind of, it's like a little brain trick. That's not the point. The point is there's two different kinds of those, the current emotions and the projection emotions, and both are valuable. So you want to recognize your current emotion and then allow yourself to feel and put yourself in that projection emotion. So an affirmation for that would look something like, I feel nervous about what I'm about to do, but I'm thankful for the opportunity to act in an empowered way. So you bring both of those sides in, which makes it a pretty cool conversation where you don't have to set aside the anxiety. You can validate it and use the other piece. So both and. All right. So jumping on to the next one, we're going to do the same thing here. What are the two parts? What does courage mean to you? And really think about that, because it'd be kind of simple to throw out the same answer as bravery, because they could be interchangeable. And then what feelings does that word spark when you hear it? Okay, maybe courage is the being able part of the answer I gave. Okay, yeah, I like that, Stephanie, because you have courage and bravery that kind of interlock to each other. Gathering the energy and resources to be brave. I like that. Confronting challenging situations. Confidence. Keep in the back of your mind, Stephanie and Jenny are kind of on to my secret here about how courage being a part of the bravery puzzle. So gathering resources and then enabling you to kind of get to that bravery. So if you were to think of bravery as the action, and courage as kind of the almost the adjective of the action, the descriptor of the action, or the thing that comes prior, the step towards. Bravery is less of a will. Oh, courage, you have more of a will to do something. Bravery is less. Yeah.
I'm sorry. We can explain. I'm just throwing things in the chat as
well.
No,
go for it.
Are speaking up. Changemakers, would we care to explain our thoughts? Anyone? No? Josh? Okay. So we were basically saying that that in times when you have courage, it's more of a kind of conscious choice. So you kind of understand what it's going on, and you have more of a will to do whatever it is you know you have to do. Whereas bravery, perhaps it's almost like your back is against the wall, and you're like, look, I'm gonna have to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I paraphrase this well enough, but say again. Bravery, you don't really know what you're getting into. Maybe. And courage is kind of like more conscious. You're like, ooh, yeah, there's this thing. You gotta get the courage to do it.
So could bravery be more reactive and courage be more proactive?
Yes.
Absolutely.
We're getting yeses and absolutely. So I think you nailed it.
I wonder if there's a head and heart connection to these. So that's an interesting question, because courage is a heart word. If anybody's ever read Brene Brown, which I did not know Brene Brown was a thing. And then I said something about vulnerability the other day, and someone was like, have you read Brene Brown? I'm like, what are you saying? And now here I am, I own all the books. So that happened several days ago. Anyway, she talks about courage being a heart word, and the original meaning of courage was to speak from your heart, to share what was in your heart and those types of things. So I read it that way as well. Like courage is the proactive. It's where your heart is kind of thinking through and manifesting these things. And then bravery is the action of that heart movement, to where you're getting to your head and then you're going forward. That's kind of how I hear that in my brain. So let's go on to the next one. This one gets to be a bit more challenging. So what does vulnerability mean to you, and what feelings does it spark? We missed some of the feelings on the courage one, but I'm thinking they're a little bit similar to the bravery. So I want to hear both of these. What does vulnerability mean? And then what feelings does that spark for you? Okay. Being open, honest, showing your true self. Vulnerability would be feeling weak or exposed. Yes. Realness. Yeah. Authenticity. Relying on others for support, having to communicate your fears, lowering your guard. Being vulnerable means taking risks. So what I'm noticing here is that it responds to vulnerability because it's more one of those like icky feelings, right? And listen, my background is early education, so I use words like icky and we just roll with it. Okay. So since it's one of those ickier feelings, it can be one that we are more likely to kind of word vomit on, right? Vulnerability is this, because we remember how that feels and we don't really care for that. And it can be more challenging to describe bravery and courage in a more authentic way, because sometimes it's easier to view ourselves on that lesser side of vulnerability instead of viewing ourselves on that higher side of bravery or courage or whatever word you're kind of seeing there. We associate ourselves more quickly with the weak and the times that we fail or lost or did something we didn't want to do, or, you know, where it's exposed, than we do with this empowered version of ourselves. So that's an interesting like side bunny trail to go down later, is why is it that we often associate ourselves so much more quickly that with this weak version that we perceive rather than this empowered version that we perceive. Take that with you. Think about it later over your coffee. It's a good brain exercise. It'll send you down some weird places. All right. So being vulnerable means taking risks, which requires courage and bravery. Yes. Being vulnerable also makes us able to be more ourselves. That's so true, which is so important. And then courage and vulnerability, two sides of the same coin. Yeah. So I think those are all good things. So acting courageously is the willingness to show vulnerability. Oh, yes, I see. So what are some, throw out some feeling words when you think about putting yourself in a vulnerable situation. Think of how you would feel if you were about to go into a vulnerable situation. What are some of those emotions that you would have? The now emotions, not the projection ones. Freezy. Nervous. Freezy. Fear. Quiet. Oh, quiet. Panic. Sweaty. I don't know about you guys. It's too much information. I don't know, but I get sweaty. I'm like, yes, all of those words are good words to describe anxiety, vulnerability, challenge. Now here's a kind of a follow-up question to that. The more vulnerable that we are, or the more consistently that we are vulnerable, do those feelings go away? Do they lessen? How do they shift? Relief? Tell me more on that one. It's how you deal with the situation in the moment.
All right.
No. I think it's when you tell someone about how you actually feel. For example, you feel relief after it.
Okay. Yeah, that's absolutely, I like that. Thank you for the explanation. I needed that. How you deal with the situation. Okay, so all right, I'm not going to go down that trail. That's a different trail. Let's see what's next here. All right, so Brene Brown describes vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. We kind of touched on those words already. But vulnerability is not weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage, which we kind of touched on that as well. So we're using that courage and that bravery to then have act within that vulnerability, which is uncertainty. It is risk, and it is emotional exposure. Like you were saying, if you are to tell someone how you actually feel, you are exposing yourself emotionally to them to then, you can't control what their reaction is. So I think of it this way. Another way to describe it is if you're using courage, so we're working in courage inside of a proactive situation. We're going into a situation, we're planning, we're working on that courage. It almost feels like we can control that because we're using our courage and bravery to go into that situation. And maybe we're relying less on the other people's response. If you were to remove courage and bravery from vulnerability, you're acting in a way whereas you cannot control the other people's responses, which then makes you feel more vulnerable, that emotional exposure. Now, it is true that when you're acting in courage or bravery, you can't control their responses there either. But there's something that kind of shifts when you're using your actions inside of these different descriptors. So if you say, think how this feels inside of your body for a second. If you were to say, I'm going to talk to this person and I'm going to be brave, think of how that makes you feel. Now, if you were going to say, I'm going to talk to this person and I'm going to be vulnerable, think of how that makes you feel. Are they different? Very different. I think when you are vulnerable, how you act in the moment can help you grow and develop confidence in your ability to deal with it. Yeah. Yes, they're very different. So, but are the actions the same? Are you going in to have this conversation really kind of with the same thing? I think the brave one sounds scarier. Sounds like you have to face something intense. Stephanie, that's funny because I would go the exact opposite. Like, I'm going to do the brave thing. Vulnerability sounds way too intense. So that one's interesting. One has guard up. The other is a willingness to show your true feelings. But I have no issue sharing my feelings. Maybe that's why I like you. Okay. So let's go on to the next one here. So if we were to kind of compare and contrast courage and bravery, so we've already kind of gotten to this point in our conversation. So courage would be that foundation needed for bravery or the next step. So it's the proactive part. We're building this piece. We're building courage within ourselves. Bravery would then be that action. But if we were to kind of take bravery and flip it upside down, kind of like I said, the name of my company is Ruin Your Life. I flipped it upside down. So let's flip bravery. We always have these positive associations with the word bravery. But if you think about it, a lot of times we're using bravery as just power through, suck it up, get it done, just do better, move faster, work harder, stand up when you don't feel like it. Would you say that this concept in this case, remember we talk about using common language. So in this context for bravery, does it sound like that use could be a bit toxic in the sense that we're dismissing our feelings and reactions for the action itself? So we're putting the action of bravery over how we feel, how we are responding in that situation, because we feel like we have to power through, suck it up, get it done. Absolutely.
I think by definition, Mike is on, by the way, guys. By definition, like you go against something you're feeling. So like bravery is in a way overriding the whatever things could be feelings. Actually, it is feelings. The feelings that are holding you back from doing an action. So in a way, you either have to consciously override something you feel, which is not like, I don't know, I almost think of it as like overriding a primary emotion with something you tell yourself you have to do. And so, yeah, it does mean going against, like, choosing to feel something over something else, which is, yeah, I don't know how I feel about that, actually, now that you put it in that context.
So I have an extension question for that then. So we know that to be even let's throw vulnerability in there, right? Vulnerability or bravery. To do an action that requires us to be brave or vulnerable, we are having to override, we've already described it, fear, anxiety, nervousness, sweatiness, these things that come with those things, right? So where does it become healthy to ignore and override those emotions versus unhealthy to dismiss those emotions, to shame ourselves for feeling those things and do it anyway? Can there be a middle ground?
I'm going to jump back in again. I wonder if I wonder, yeah, I don't know if there's a middle ground, because I struggle to compare the two. I almost feel as if bravery has to do with gritting your teeth and like completely tensing up is the feeling that I get and just doing it. Whereas vulnerability is the exact opposite. I almost imagine myself as like a snail without a shell kind of thing. So I wonder if they're even on the same spectrum, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I love that. I think that's a very accurate descriptor of the conversation that we've been having. So let's drop bravery. Let's go back to vulnerability. We want to take an action inside of this vulnerable emotion. We are now the snail. Okay. We've lost our shell. We're just roaming in the wind. So when we're taking this action, what does it look like to have the feelings that we are overriding and take that action without like dismissing or shaming away those feelings?
Chelsea, can you rephrase that?
Sure. So is there a way that we can validate how we're feeling in that moment, allow ourselves to feel that anxiety and etc., and take the action instead of saying, how dare you feel nervous about this? Like, you're being so stupid. Just do better and do these things that you need to do. It's going to be fine. What would it sound like to validate yourself and take the action instead of shame yourself and take the action? Requires a decision to love yourself in the moment and accept your own flaws of imperfection. Yeah. So if you recall at the beginning, I talked about an affirmation where you're saying, I feel anxiety about this that I'm about to do, which is okay. I'm excited for the opportunity to take on something that requires me to be vulnerable. So at the same time that you're taking that on, you're validating that you're feeling nervous about it. And that's kind of where you hit that middle ground, is really you're responsible for not slipping into that toxic side. And so much of that comes internally, because if you're shaming yourself for a certain feeling that you're feeling, then you're sliding into that toxic piece. So a lot of the weight falls onto you through those affirmations. So I'm going to tell you quickly how I would use that in my own life and give you a scenario. So braving my way through is kind of what I did. It's what a lot of us do. It can be very much associated with, I don't know if you've heard of the term like hustle culture or those types of things, right? It's how a lot of us feel that we're supposed to handle our experiences. And braving my way through for me looked a lot like neglecting or shaming the emotions that I was feeling instead of allowing myself to feel those things. So for example, I was working in a school when I was 25, and the director that I was teaching in a classroom, the director that was there continued to be more and more absent. So I kind of started stepping up and helping as I could to keep the school running. I'd been there for several years, all of that. As I was doing that, I became less and less involved in my classroom, which meant my assistant teacher was taking on responsibilities that were not hers to bear, more responsibilities than she was qualified for, paid for, trained for, etc. I was doing less and less of my tasks that I was required to do. I was doing less of with my students and with their families inside of that classroom. I was using my rest time or my home time, my family time to complete work because I was holding both roles. At the same time, I was pulling away from my coworkers and my friends because I didn't want to admit that I was having a really hard time keeping up with this, as well as I didn't want to make my boss at the time look bad. So I wanted to protect her. I wanted to protect me. I wanted to take care of all these things. I wanted it to look like everything was working smoothly, even though it wasn't. So that was me braving my way through. I don't know if any of y'all can relate to that, or if you've ever had experience where you're braving your way through something. Maybe it's just me, I don't really know. But that would be me braving my way through. So before I give you the flip side of what kind of vulnerability would look like in that, what if you kind of think through the indicators that I gave for braving my way through, it looks like this. The bullet point list would be, I started relying on people in ways that they weren't in my life to be relied upon, which for example, would be asking my assistant teacher to do more than she was put in that place to do. So overextending that piece of the relationship. I began to pull away from other people around me, coworkers and all those types of things for several reasons: shame, pride, guilt, etc. I began to lose my home and family time to put it more towards something else. I was hyper fixating on the problem. And then I started to just lose my mental, emotional, physical health. So those are some indicators of, I know that I'm braving my way through a situation. So if you were to share some indicators that you have experienced that kind of are your red flag to go, maybe I'm braving my way through this, what would that look like? Jenny says it connects a lot with being honest in the truest sense with ourselves and reflecting on impacts versus intention. Ooh, impact over intention. Now that is a whole conversation we could have right there. We're going to do a whole, Brian, we need an impact over intention provocation. Please add that to the list. Thank you.
I'm gonna write it down right now.
Keeping myself to myself. Yeah, that's a big indicator for me that I'm braving my way through. Not being able to ask for help. Mm-hmm. What would be some emotions tied to braving your way through it? Not being honest with yourself, or hard to realize you're doing it while you're doing it. Yes. If you are able to pull it, if you're able to recognize it inside the moment, then you are training yourself to have that higher level of awareness of where you are and what you're experiencing. But very often it's post braving our way through that we're like, oh. So I think that's why it's valuable to be able to kind of put out these emotions and red flags for yourself, so that later when you're kind of in that moment, if you see a couple of these pop up, it triggers that awareness in you to go, maybe something's off here. Overwhelm would be a good emotion. Lack of clarity of thinking, yeah, which is another hard one to see in the moment, because you don't have clarity to see that you have lack of clarity. So that's that. I had a shorter fuse, right? So my frustration would hit quicker. Avoidance is a good one. So those are some red flags. So I would challenge you to think through, what does it feel like? What does it look like for you to brave your way through, and really kind of keep that list there. I have a lot of red flags. Being there for everyone else and you have no time for yourself. All of these are red flags for braving your way through it. So I would challenge you to kind of write some of yours, 4 or 5, not a whole bunch. Don't be Brian. Let's just pick a couple, put them there, and then use them as red flags. So if you find yourself in the pattern of these emotions or experiences, then it might cause you to kind of reflect some on what's going on in your life that might be braving your way through, instead of taking it with vulnerability and authenticity. So now let me tell you what it could have looked like, or what I ended up doing that allowed me to operate more in authenticity or vulnerability. So it played out. I ended up taking over that role. The director tried to sell me the school for $72,000, which, bonus fact, she didn't own the school. So that was fun. So I was kind of forced to go to the owners of the school and say, hey, this is going on. And some things that happened inside of that was them saying, why didn't you come to us sooner? It'd been like a year at this point. I was really struggling. My classroom was struggling. My assistant teacher was struggling. My family was struggling, right? That even the director was struggling. Everything was kind of going, but not really well. And that was hard for me to answer. I was like, well, I mean, I don't know. I had it. And they were like, but did you? Like, well, kind of. I mean, yeah, it's fine. So I had to reflect back on that. So if I would have, from that point, I then had to act more authentically or vulnerable. So I had to go to so they made me director, yay, of a burning school. It's fine. So I had to go to my staff and say, hey, here's what's been going on. Here's how I feel like I have failed in this point. Here's what I'm choosing to do next. I had to then go to the parents and talk with them about what I had done in the classroom to kind of miss some of those pieces that I was supposed to be doing, etc. So I had to then shift everything's fine. I'm going to take it on myself. I'm going to mask my frustration, my pain. I'm going to mask what it looks like. I'm not going to give this real version. And because I was forced to, I had to then shift to vulnerability, which then meant exposing myself to the staff and all of that to be able to say, here's what was really going on. Here's how I'm feeling. And here's the biggest part of vulnerability is the ability to say to another person, what do you think? How do you think we could do this together? How could we work together to get to this next point? And that was a critical piece for me, because then we as a team were able to take on this instead of me braving my way through it. And that's often kind of a bonus of vulnerability, is when you are vulnerable to another human, many times they're vulnerable back, which then allows you to function together. So bravery often isolates you. You can brave your way through, but you're going to do it over here by yourself. Vulnerability, when done in a healthy way, more often gives you that community. So then you're able to move forward and do that together. So that's kind of the side by side of Chelsea braving her way through versus Chelsea being forced to be vulnerable, but on my own versus inside of that community. We ended up turning the school around and everybody, forgave me and it was fine. So now let's kind of go on to that. What if you took that same scenario that you were thinking of in your head, where those red flags are popping up, and you took the bravery and you switched it for that uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure? So whatever you were kind of thinking in your brain when I said, what are the red flags that tell you you're braving your way through? Whatever that situation was, if you were to flip it the way that I kind of just flipped mine, what would that feel like or look like to you? And this may not be something you respond to here, but just in your head, what would you have done differently? What affirmations could you have said to yourself? How might you have changed your self-talk? How might you have changed the way that you talked to the people around you? How might you have used your time differently? So these are all questions that I ask myself when I'm reflecting back on a situation, either after it's already over and I know that I braved my way through it and I want to do it better next time, or once I'm in the middle of it and realize that I am braving my way through and I want to shift it before it's over. So those are the questions that I go through and ask myself as a reflective practice. So those would be probably some good questions to keep and think through as you find your red flags. Then you go through and ask those and see what that next part can get you, how you can move forward from there. So there's a couple more questions in here that we either throw some things in the chat or we can, or just hold on to them as a reflection question. So what does vulnerability take from you that bravery doesn't? So would you agree that when you choose to be vulnerable, you're giving something up or allowing that vulnerability to take something from you? What is it that you lose in vulnerability that you don't in bravery? Pride. Yes. I think that's a good one. And that kind of covers so many bases. Vulnerability does take that from you. My word for something very similar would be ego. Vulnerability takes my ego from me instead that bravery doesn't take from me. So then if you were go on to kind of the next side. So what does vulnerability give to you that bravery doesn't? Because when you take those types of actions, you are going to get something back in as well. So what are you getting through those actions? Pride. I'm sorry, control. That's a good one too. Honesty, truth, openness, truth. OMG.
Because Brian and I
I don't know
both
what's
wrote
happening.
honesty at the same time. That's why we're OMGing.
Got it. Yes. So would it be a fair statement then that you're kind of trading pride, ego, control for honesty, openness, and OMG? You're giving one to get the other, but you can't really have both. So until you're willing to set one side down, then you're able to kind of reap the benefits of the other, but holding on to both of those things could prove to be pretty challenging. So now think of yourself in that same situation. What are some obstacles that you're running into that's keeping you from embracing that vulnerability? So if you were to throw some out there, what are some obstacles that you hit? And this can be a physical obstacle, like a human in your life, or it could be a mental obstacle, a feeling or emotion. Experiences. Yeah. Fear of the reaction, conditioning. Yeah. So your brain is saying, I have data points that say vulnerability is bad. And here's why. So that's often a hard one to kind of overcome. But the more that we choose to be vulnerable or even prep ourselves in our self-talk, the more that we're shifting those neural pathways to a new place. Fear of being perceived as a weak person. Yeah. Opinions or perceptions of opinions of others. Yes. Judgment. Okay. So here's a question. Lack of trust. Lack of trust. Okay. So here's a question. When you're looking at these things that popped up, judgment, fear of being perceived as weak. What is in that sentence? Is it a fear of being weak, or is it a fear of a perception of being weak? Is it your opinion of yourself or the opinions or perceptions of others? Is it fear of your reaction or the fear of the other person's reaction? So how many of these obstacles are external focused rather than internal focused? So the next one would be, can showing vulnerability make us look weak? And I think that's a part that we've already kind of talked about. And I think, so I'll answer that one. I do think vulnerability can make you look weak. If you were to think about the word weak in its general sense right now, right? If you were to throw that word out to a community on Twitter and ask if weak is a good or bad thing, you're going to get, it's probably a bad thing. You don't want to do that. But for yourself, I would encourage you to define that word. So what does it mean for you to be weak? Does that mean that you've recognized an area that you can be stronger in? Does weak mean that you're allowing yourself to move from being less strong in one area to more strong in another area? So is weak the opposite of strength? Weakness the opposite of strength? Or is it the stepping stone to get to that place? And can you be strong or have strength without at one point recognizing that you have a quote unquote weakness in that space? So is weak or weakness inherently bad, or is it a valuable place to be? The weakness versus strength paradox. I love paradoxes. They're my favorite. So just so we're all aware. Okay, so what do you need to do to empower yourself to be vulnerable? If you were to kind of think through all right, here are 2 actions I can take. I'll tell you what mine are. Mine are very much self-talk. So affirmations is a big one for me. When I'm feeling one way, like I just did for weak, how can I flip this? If I'm telling myself, you're being weak, then all right, well, let's flip that. What does it mean to be weak? It's really those two pieces. I ask myself a lot of clarifying questions. What does that mean? If I'm calling myself that or talking to myself that way, can I better define that to understand a common language? And then redefining my self-talk. So allowing myself to feel those things and still take the action. So an affirmation for that could be, I understand that I have feelings of weakness. And I am thankful for the opportunity to grow inside of that space and become stronger. So that would be an example of that. So then I think lastly, how can you celebrate your vulnerability? And this is something that is individual for every single person. So when you start to act more and more in a vulnerable way, in smaller, big ways, what does it feel like to kind of celebrate that inside of yourself with the people around you? And in a variety of ways. And I think it's important to have that as a part of this whole equation as well, because you've done the hard thing. Now, what does it look like to celebrate or recognize that hard thing that you've done? Because then you're giving your brain that positive reinforcement. What gets encouraged gets repeated. So how are you encouraging yourself in that thing that you just did so that you're creating that new experience and that new neural pathway for your brain to say, oh, we can do that again. I didn't die, but did you die? No, we're fine. And do it again. So how are you celebrating that vulnerability in yourself? So that's really it. That's all of my questions. This last one is just how you can find me where I live. But Brian, where do we go from here?
Chelsea, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's so good. Like I think I want to share this slide deck with the learners, the change makers, and with everybody who's here today.